So in this video, we'll be looking at the concept of microevolution. So a couple things to remind ourselves of before we start talking about microevolution. Remember fertilization. Sperm plus egg equals zygote. And remember haploid diploid, whereas the sperm and the egg are both haploid and they combine to make a diploid zygote. And remember that there are traits that those haploid cells carry, and one of those cells might carry a dominant trait and the other cell might carry a recessive trait, and they combine to make the heterozygous organism. And so we're going to be dealing again with these things like dominant and recessives and heterozygouses and that sort of thing. And so it's important for us to just kind of review this before we go on. And my A's stick around. I'll get rid of those real quickly. And it's important for us to remind ourselves that populations are what change over time, not individuals. When we study this idea of natural selection, and particularly microevolution, it is what a population is what we are studying. We're not studying individuals, and so we will track changes in those populations. And we need to define this as well. What is a species? Well, a species is an organism, and there's a couple of different ways to define species. We're not going to get into that, but a species is an organism that is able, or is a group of organisms that are able to reproduce together and make fertile offspring. And so they are so genetically similar to one another that when they breed, they make more of those kinds of organisms that are also able to reproduce as well. And so we will talk about, I don't believe in this particular video, we won't be talking about this concept, but we will talk about the idea of species that can reproduce together but don't make fertile offspring. So when we use the word species, we're talking about the product or the offspring being fertile. And it's important to talk about this difference between population versus this idea of geographic range. And so a population is one specific given area, but in the case of organisms that are pretty common, like gray squirrels are a great example, ourselves, there may be several populations that cover wide expanses of territory. Of course, in the case of our own species, the globe is our range. There's millions of different populations. You think of a population of a city or a particular region or whatever. And so we're looking at that. But with other species, you're going to have gene pools that may not interact with one another. Within our own population, the world is very small now because of travel, and the gene pools are more and more interacting with one another. But with something like a salamander, there's going to be geographic difficulties when it comes to a mountain range, which would be that white area in the middle there, or a really dry desert, which would be represented down here in this area. Salamanders really don't like deserts, and so they're not going to go there. And so there's going to be particular geographic boundaries, and this is going to change or cause a population to change. And I put our own geographic range just in case we needed to know. And Greenland, of course, is white again, but there are people that live there. Now, this brings us to our friend, the Hardy-Weinberg theorem. Now, before we talk about Hardy-Weinberg, I want to talk about a few other things, because it's Hardy-Weinberg basically is a way to measure evolution. It is a way to, with a number, put a measurement on change in a population. There is the idea that if you look at the allele frequency of a given population, so you have here big R, and the homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, and heterozygous. And if you look at any population over time, let's say that I'm just going to put some percents on here just for the sake of discussion. Let's say that at this particular time, these are the 3% that are found in the population. If you come back in 100 years and those percentages have changed to that, then you would say there has been a change in this population. And what do we call that change in the population over time? We call that evolution. And so the Hardy-Weinberg theorem then is a way for us to then measure that change. And there's two equations that you'll use with this. I'm going to make a separate video in which I go over how to use these equations. But for now, I'm just going to talk about them. And the first one is this one. P plus Q equals 1, whereas P refers to the percentage of dominant alleles in the population, and Q refers to the percentage of recessive alleles in a population. So let's just look at this particular population. Let's say that our population has 3 flowers in it. Well, P in this case would be 0.5. And why do you say that? Well, there are 6 total alleles that you see here, right? 3 big R's, 3 little r's. 3 of those alleles are big R's. So 3 out of 6, or 0.5. And what would be the percentage, or what would be Q, or the percentage of recessive alleles? It too would be 0.5, and that equals 1. Fairly simple. Now, what if you were given something? I mean, this is just Algebra 1, 8th grade math here, but just so we're all clear, a problem says in a given population, Q equals 0.73, then you know that P has to equal 0.27, because that's just math. P plus Q equals 1. All right, and as with all equations, you will be given this equation, and you will also be told the information of P equals dominant alleles and Q equals recessive alleles. So if P equals dominant alleles, then what if we just wanted to know the percentage of homozygous dominant in a population? Well, that would be P times P, or P squared, right? And what if we just wanted to know the percentage of recessive? Well, that would be Q squared. What if we wanted to know the percentage of heterozygous? Well, this one's a little trickier, because how many combinations between these two alleles are there? Well, there's big R, little r, but there's also little r, big R. So there's 2 different equations there. And so we would say that this one is 2 PQ. And if you add all those together, what do you get? Well, you get the total organisms in a population, or 100%. Guess what? There's an equation for this one too. And so this is the second equation for the Hardy-Weinberg theorem, is that P squared plus 2PQ equals Q squared, or plus Q squared equals 1. Whereas P squared is equal to the percentage of, and these are all percentages, don't forget that, percentage of homozygous dominant. 2PQ is equal to the percentage of heterozygous, and Q squared is equal to the percentage of homozygous recessive. And so what this one gives you, whereas the previous equation gave you the percentage of alleles, dominant and recessive, this equation gives you the genotype frequencies. Now, this information over here is not included on the AP formula sheet as of the last year. And so you do need to be able to figure that out for yourself, which is not hard. Again, if you just go back to what we did on the last slide, you should be able to figure that out. Now, this can be used to do different kinds of problems. And so we're going to demonstrate that again. I'm going to have a separate video in which we go over those kinds of problems. So what if a population then is not changing? Let's say we come to a population and, P plus Q, you have 0.5, 0.5. Let's go back to our flowers back here. And the population looks like this. And let's say that we get to 1,000 years from now and we come back and we measure P and Q again, and the population hasn't changed. That population is is at genetic equilibrium. Sometimes you will see this called Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. All right. And the idea is this, that there's no change in the allele frequencies, then there's no evolution that is occurring. Now, we would expect this to not be the norm because the strong is always surviving, right? And the weak is always dying off. And so this is not going to be the norm. In fact, Hardy-Weinberg, these two scientists, they're two scientists. I didn't mention their first names or anything, but you just always see them together. These two guys said, in fact, this is so rare that in order for that to occur, in order for there to be no change in a population or for a population to be at equilibrium, these 5 things must be present. So I'm going to walk through these 5 things. Population has to be extremely large. This makes sense. In our population of 3 flowers back here, if there's the smallest change, let's just say we have one more come in here, one more of those kinds of flowers, then all of a sudden we have 7 alleles, or no, 8 alleles, total, and 5 of them are little r. And so our equations or our numbers are going to shift dramatically. What if you have 10,000 flowers and 2 little r's come in? You're going to see very little change in that population. So for a population to be at equilibrium, the population has to be very large. Second, there has to be no gene flow. Now, we haven't really defined gene flow, but it should make sense. Genes flowing or moving. And so this would be nothing is coming into the population and nothing is going out of the population. There's no migration into or out of a population that would cause any kind of change. If you have a population of 30 sheep and they're all white and then 2 black sheep move into the population, you would expect the frequency of those alleles of the black sheep to increase over the years because it's going to change that population. And so the second one is no gene flow, no mutations. There can be no mutations in a population. That means just no random changes to the DNA, and this should be self-explanatory for you. Random mating. Now, this one may seem odd and usually does to people, but random mating basically means that when it comes time, let's go back to our population of let's say 10,000 sheep in this case, there's no reason for a female sheep to choose one male sheep over another, meaning they all have desirable traits. And so there's no selection process. And so when we talk about random mating, meaning everything is so similar that it might as well be random. There's no reason to choose one over another. Or you could go on the other side of the spectrum and you could say everything is so different that there's no discernible pattern to that. When we think of like a grizzly bear population, which male bear gets to mate? The one that wins the fight, not the one with the cutest ears. And so you think about our own human population, random mating is probably what's happening. And you think that's nuts. That's not. No, it is what's happening, because what one person sees as desirable traits in a mate, another person may think, no, not for me. And so you don't have people duking it out for the mate. I guess some people do, but it's not generally accepted in society. Whereas in grizzly bear society, it's perfectly normal for two dudes to be fighting and that to be the norm. And so that's a way to think about random mating. There's no one pattern to selection. And then of course the last one, no natural selection, meaning that the environment is not acting on one set of parameters more or less than it is on another, that everyone in that population has an equal chance of survival. There's no survival of the fittest. Now, this is not normal for populations to be in this sort of equilibrium. This is typically artificial. And so like a zoo or like some sort of animal sanctuary where the animals don't have limited resources, they're not preying upon one another, there's no flow into and out of, you can think of something like that. I would even argue that our own population, human population, is currently at equilibrium. And if you look at the different traits here, the only one that really makes sense is mutations. But the way that our society is set up, there's no reason to select one mutation over another. People who have genetic abnormalities, we don't single them out and select against them. In fact, our society tends to rally around those individuals and help them. And so there's some argument that could be made that our own population is not currently changing because we have kind of stepped outside of this realm. Now, that's discussion. That's a point of argument, and it could easily be discussed and talked about. But in general, populations do not live in this genetic equilibrium.